When I first moved in with Mark, I thought I had everything under control. It was supposed to be a simple roommate situation, a way to split the rent in the overpriced city we both lived in. Mark needed someone to share his two-bedroom apartment, and I needed somewhere to live. It was perfect in theory. Mark seemed laid back when I first met him. He had that easygoing charm that made it clear he didn't stress about much. Light brown hair that was always just a little too sold, the kind of smile that made people want to be around him. He was friendly, athletic, and completely oblivious to the effect he had on people, including me. I noticed right away that he was attractive, but it didn't bother me at first. I could keep those thoughts in check. We were just roommates after all, and I wasn't about to make things weird by catching feelings for the guy who was letting me live in his apartment. But of course, nothing ever goes as planned. We settled into our routine easily enough. I worked from home as a freelance writer while Mark worked long hours at his job in tech. Most days, I barely saw him. We'd exchange brief pleasantries in the kitchen or in the hallway, maybe watch a movie together in the evening if we were both around. He was comfortable. Safe. I told myself that as long as I kept things casual, there was no danger. But then Mark started inviting me to hang out. It was never anything major, just grabbing a beer after work, maybe hitting the gym together. At first, I resisted. I had to. I knew that the more time I spent with him, the harder it would be to keep my distance. But Mark had a way of wearing you down without even realizing it. He'd knock on my door with that stupidly charming smile and ask if I wanted to grab a drink, and suddenly, I'd find myself saying yes without even thinking about it. That's how it started, the slow, inevitable unraveling of the walls I had built around myself. It was on one of those nights, after a few too many drinks, that I realized I was in trouble. We'd gone to a bar down the street from our apartment, a low-key place that wasn't too loud, the kind of place where you could have a conversation without shouting. Mark had already downed 2 beers by the time we sat down, and he was in a good mood, laughing easily, teasing me about how much of a workaholic I was. "You need to get out more, Jake," he said, grinning as he leaned back in his chair. "All you ever do is work. Live a little." I rolled my eyes, but there was a smile tugging at my lips. "Some of us have deadlines, you know," I shot back. "Not all of us can afford to go to the gym and bars every day." He laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that made my stomach twist. "Life's too short to be stressed all the time. Trust me, you'll thank me later." And that's when it hit me, the way my heart skipped a beat when he smiled at me, the way I wanted to spend more time with him to make him laugh. I was falling for him. I tried to brush it off, to tell myself it was just a passing crush. It would fade eventually. But the more time I spent with Mark, the more difficult it became to deny what I was feeling. He was kind, funny, and had this magnetic energy that made people want to be around him. I wanted to be around him. Too much. But Mark was straight. That much was obvious. He talked about his ex-girlfriends, flirted with women at the bar, and always had a date lined up for the weekend. That wasn't stupid. I knew there was no chance of anything happening between us. But that didn't stop me from wanting more. It didn't stop me from lying awake at night, thinking about what it would be like if things were different. The breaking point came one night, after we had both come back from the bar. Mark had had more to drink than usual, and we were both a little tipsy by the time we made it back to the apartment. We collapsed onto the couch, laughing about something ridiculous that had happened earlier in the night, and for a moment, everything felt easy. "You know," Mark said, his words slurring slightly as he looked over at me, "I wasn't sure about having a roommate again. But I'm glad you moved in. You're a good guy, Jake." "Solid." I chuckled, trying to ignore the warmth spreading through my chest at his words. "Thanks," I said, keeping my tone light. "You're not so bad yourself." He grinned, his head falling back against the couch cushions as he let out a content sigh. "I mean it," he murmured, his voice softer now. "You're good to be around. I feel like I can be myself with you, you know." My heart clenched painfully at his words, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to what he was saying. But then he blinked, his expression clearing, and he sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "Man, I'm drunk," he muttered, shaking his head. "We should probably get to bed." I nodded quickly, standing up before I could let myself dwell on what had just happened. "Yeah, definitely," I said, retreating to my room before anything else could be said. or before I could let myself hope for something that would never happen. After that night, everything changed. At least for me. I couldn't stop thinking about what Mark had said, about the way he had looked at me, the way his words had made me feel like maybe, just maybe, there was something more between us. But I knew better. Mark was straight. Nothing was ever going to happen between us. I had to accept that. But the more I tried to distance myself from him, the more it hurt. I started avoiding him, making excuses when he asked me to hang out, staying in my room when he was home. I told myself it was for the best. That I needed space to get over whatever it was I was feeling. But Mark wasn't the kind of guy to let things slide. One evening, he cornered me in the kitchen, his brow furrowed with concern. "Hey," he said, crossing his arms over his chest, "what's going on with you? You've been acting weird for the past few weeks." Did I do something? I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. "No," I said quietly, looking down at the floor. "You didn't do anything. It's just me." Mark took a step closer, concern flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked softly. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening with the weight of what I was about to say. I like you, Mark," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark stared at me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might get angry, that he might tell me to leave. But instead, he just sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jake," he said quietly, shaking his head. I don't know what to say." I nodded, already feeling the sting of rejection. "I'm straight," he continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I care about you, but I can't give you what you want." "I know," I whispered, blinking back tears. I just needed to say it. After that night, everything was different. Mark and I still talked, still hung out, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. He didn't bring up what had happened, didn't act weird or awkward around me. But I could tell he was being careful, like he was afraid of doing something that might hurt me more. And it was killing me. Every time I saw him, it hurt. Every time I heard him laugh or saw him smile, it was like a reminder of everything I couldn't have. And then there were the girls, the endless parade of women he dated, flirted with, and brought back to the apartment. Each one of them was a painful reminder of how out of place I was in his life. I tried to get over him. I really did. But how could I move on when every day I was confronted with the reality that he would never see me the way I saw him? It was after one particularly difficult night that I made my decision. Mark had brought a girl home again, a tall, blonde woman who seemed to fit perfectly into his world. They had laughed together, sitting close on the couch while I pretended not to notice from the kitchen. But I did notice. I always noticed. And that was when I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stay here, living with him, watching him move on with his life while I was stuck in this painful cycle of wanting something I could never have. I had to leave. It was the only way I could move on. The next morning, I started looking for a new place. I didn't have much money saved, but I'd figure it out. I had to. Anything was better than staying here, living with the constant ache in my chest. A week later, I sat Mark down in the living room, my heart pounding as I prepared to tell him the truth. "Mark," I began, my voice shaky, "I need to talk to you." He looked up from his phone, his expression curious but unconcerned. "What's up?" I took a deep breath, forcing the words out before I lost my nerve. "I'm moving out," I said quickly. "I found a new place. It's not far, but I just need some space." Mark's face fell, the casual smile slipping from his lips. "Moving out," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "Why? Is this because of what you said before? Jake, you don't have to leave. We can still be friends." I shook my head, my throat tight with emotion. "It's not just that, Mark," I said quietly. "It's everything. I can't stay here, knowing that nothing will ever change. I need to move on." Mark stared at me, his eyes filled with something like regret. "I'm sorry, Jake," he said softly. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I whispered. "I know you didn't." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had gone unsaid hanging heavy between us. And in that moment, I knew this was the end. There was no going back. No more pretending. A week later, I packed up my things and left the apartment for good. I didn't say goodbye to Mark. I couldn't. It was too painful. Instead, I left him a note on the kitchen counter thanking him for everything, but telling him I needed to move on. And then I walked out, closing the door on that chapter of my life. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. But it was also the only way I could begin to heal. In the months that followed, I started to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I thought about Mark when I wondered if things could have been different. But deep down, I knew they couldn't. Mark wasn't the person I was meant to be with. He never could have been. It had been 3 years since I left. 3 years since I'd packed my things, left Mark's apartment, and tried to close the door on everything we had shared. Or, more accurately, everything I had felt, and everything he couldn't feel back. 3 years is a long time, long enough for the pain to dull, for the ache in my chest to fade into something like acceptance. But there were still moments when I thought about him. Moments when a song would play on the radio or I'd pass a familiar place in the city, and memories of Mark would flood back, uninvited and unwanted. I'd wonder what he was doing, whether he was happy, whether he had found someone. But I never reached out. I had made my choice, and it was better for both of us to keep it that way. That's what I told myself anyway. It was a typical Friday night, and I was at a bar with a few friends from work. The same kind of bar Mark and I used to go to back when we were roommates. It was loud, crowded, and filled with the buzz of conversation, music, and laughter. I was sipping my drink, half listening to my friend's conversation when I saw him. Mark, he was standing across the room, leaning against the bar with a beer in hand, talking to someone I didn't recognize. My heart stuttered in my chest, and for a moment it felt like the air had been knocked out of me. He looked the same, still effortlessly handsome, still with that same easy confidence that had drawn me in all those years ago. But there was something different too. He looked older, more serious. His hair was a little shorter, and there was a hint of stubble on his jaw that hadn't been there before. I hadn't expected to see him. In fact, I had spent the last 3 years carefully avoiding places I knew he might be. But there he was, standing not 20 feet away from me, completely unaware of my presence. For a moment, I considered leaving. It would be easy enough to slip out of the bar and notice, to avoid the inevitable awkwardness of seeing him again. But something kept me rooted in place. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to run from him anymore. So I stayed. It wasn't long before Mark noticed me. He glanced in my direction, and I saw the moment his eyes locked onto mine. His expression shifted from casual to surprise, and then something else, something I couldn't quite read. For a moment, he just stared at me as if he was trying to decide whether or not to come over. And then, slowly, he started making his way across the bar. My heart was pounding in my chest by the time he reached me, and I had no idea what to say. Should I pretend like nothing had happened? Should I acknowledge the way we had parted? There were 1,000 things I wanted to say, but none of them felt right. "Jake," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Hey." "Hey," I echoed, feeling the awkwardness settle between us like a thick fog. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, and yet, standing in front of him, it was like no time had passed at all. He looked the same, and yet everything felt different. There was a long and comfortable pause before Mark spoke again. "It's been a while," he said, his voice tentative, like he wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. "Yeah," I agreed, trying to keep my voice steady. 3 years. Mark nodded, his gaze flicking to the floor for a moment before meeting mine again. "How have you been?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded genuine. Like he actually wanted to know. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Good. Been busy with work, you know." "And are you seeing anyone?" he asked, the question coming out almost hesitantly. I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I've dated a bit, but nothing serious." Mark nodded again, and for a moment neither of us spoke. It felt like we were circling around something, both of us afraid to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And then, finally, Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jake, I'm really sorry," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. "I know things didn't end well between us. And I hate that we just stopped talking. I've thought about you a lot over the years. I should have reached out." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't expected an apology. I hadn't expected him to admit that he had thought about me at all. "I've thought about you too," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "But I needed space, Mark. I needed to move on." "I know," he said quickly, nodding. "And I get that. I don't know, I guess I never realized how much you meant to me until you were gone." My heart skipped a beat at his words, and I tried to ignore the way my pulse quickened. It would be so easy to fall back into old feelings, to let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. But I wasn't that same person anymore. And neither was he. "Mark," I began, my voice soft but steady. "You know we can't go back, right? We can't undo what happened." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking you to. I wanted to see you again. To see how you were doing." I studied him for a long moment, trying to figure out what he wanted from me. It was clear that he had changed over the years. He seemed more mature, more grounded. But the fact remained that he was still Mark, and I was still Jake. And nothing could change what had happened between us. "I'm doing okay," I finally said, offering him a small smile. "I'm getting by." Mark smiled back, but there was a sadness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly. "And for what it's worth, I really am sorry. For everything." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. Hearing him say the words, hearing him apologize, felt like the final piece I needed to let go. "It's okay," I said softly. "I'm okay now." There was a long pause, and for a moment it felt like we were both waiting for something more to happen. But nothing did. There was no grand reconciliation, no dramatic declaration of feelings. Just two people standing in a crowded bar, acknowledging the past and accepting that it couldn't be undone. "Take care of yourself, Jake," Mark said after a long moment, his voice soft but sincere. "You too, Mark," I replied, and with that, he turned and walked away. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and maybe even a little bit of peace. I had loved him once in a way that had nearly broken me. But standing there watching him disappear into the crowd, I realized that I didn't love him anymore. Not like that. And that was okay.